So let it be said that Mitchell is clearly a genius. He writes as though at the helm of some perpetual dream machine, can evidently do anything, and his ambition is written in magma across this novel's every page. But Cloud Atlas is the sort of book that makes that ambition seem slightly suspect. The novel is frustrating not because it is too smart, but because it is not nearly as smart as its author. That's from Tom Bissell's 2004 review of Cloud Atlas for the New York Times. So I'm a huge lover of film. When I was younger, I realized that I gravitated towards certain directors in the same way that one gravitates towards certain authors. Two guys that really stuck out to me around sort of my high school years into my college years were Paul Thomas Anderson, who had done Hard Eight and Boogie Nights, as well as Magnolia, which I love, but a lot of people find to be a challenging film. As well as David Lynch, who did Wild at Heart and Eraserhead and Lost Highway, amongst many other very strange films, such as Blue Velvet. Now, I bring both of these directors up because at some point in their career, they ended up doing something entirely different. In David Lynch's case, in 1999, he did a movie called The Straight Story, which is kind of an accurate title. It involves a sort of simple parable of an older man who wants to see his brother before he or his brother dies, and ends up driving a tractor across the United States. And it doesn't contain any of Lynch's usual, up until that point, strange kind of Twin Peaks-esque bizarre America touches that you would expect, especially a road trip going across the country. In the case of Paul Thomas Anderson, in 2002, he ended up releasing Punch Drunk Love, which, amongst other things, was one of the only films I've ever been able to tolerate Adam Sandler. Again, it is a relatively straightforward film that, unlike Hard Eight or Magnolia or Boogie Nights, does not involve the kind of insane one-take Scorsese-esque multi-scene editing and crisscrossing that he was known for at the time. I bring both of these films up and both of these directors up because though I do, especially in the case of The Straight Story, really adore the film, and I think that Punch Drunk Love is a very good film, I had the sneaking suspicion at the time that whilst the directors wanted to do these films, they were also a kind of a, fuck you, I can do a normal movie. That they were sort of a rebuff to critics who felt they were incapable of doing a straightforward film. That they were incapable of not using their extensive bag of tricks, which at that point for each of them, who had several films under their belt, some were feeling was becoming a bit gimmicky. This brings me to David Mitchell. He is an English author who spent extensive amount of time in Asia and has written several books in a very distinctive, dizzying style of prose. So I was around 31, traveling in Southeast Asia myself, when someone gave me a copy of Ghostwritten. I had never heard of the novel and I had never heard of the author. But instantly I was blown away, especially since this was a first novel. Ghostwritten is told from multiple, seemingly disjointed points of view. So every chapter takes on a new narrator, but not just the narrator, but their own personal style and the way that they would have written the chapter. Ghostwritten seems to be a pretty spot-on title. This can go from everything from an old communist Chinese lady living at the top of the hill in mainland China who's convinced that the spirit of a tree is talking to her, to a New York radio DJ, to Russian gangsters, to a disembodied artificial intelligence. And eventually they all crisscross and connect in the end of the novel in what I find to be a somewhat sublime way. Immediately after I had read that book, I looked up his other books. I read Number 9 Dream, which to this day, is my favorite David Mitchell novel. That novel features a young man who is seeking out his father in Tokyo. And what should be a relatively straightforward story instead seamlessly goes between his innermost thoughts, his wild imagination, and the things that are actually going around him. He'll be in a cafe thinking about his life, and suddenly the floods outside of the cafe will be so high that the cars will be riding by. And Mitchell creates this dreamlike connection by never expressly telling you that you've gone from reality to within his very wild imagination. I still love it to this day. Now, his third novel, Cloud Atlas, is perhaps the most known. This was in part because the Wachowskis of The Matrix and Tom Tykwer of Run Lola Run decided to take it upon themselves, along with a large cast of actors, including Tom Hanks and Halle Berry and Hugh Grant, amongst many others, to do one of the largest independent film experiments ever undertaken. Essentially, they shot a blockbuster film, all personally financed by the director and actors and Kickstarters and everything else. It was a massive, massive financial failure. However, I still think it is a fairly fascinating movie and a very strong case for why certain books are unadaptable. In many ways, I feel as if the film improved upon the connections within the novel. For example, by having the same actors play different characters throughout different periods of time. To give you a base idea of that novel, essentially, David Mitchell described it as, to think of it like a babushka, like one of those Russian puzzle dolls. It starts with a 18th century mariner's journal, and then halfway through that journal, for seemingly no reason, it moves into the 19th century into a series of letters. And then again, halfway through that story, for no reason, it breaks into the 80s, into almost a thriller, which then again breaks forward into the far future, which then eventually moves into so far in the future that they're speaking a completely different language. And that's the halfway point in the novel. And then the rest of the novel finishes the other half of the stories. And they're only very tenuously connected by some ancestors and some ideas. In some ways, at the time, I felt like it was definitely his most ambitious novel, but I can almost understand the Times critic in that it was sort of a show of strength, like that he could do it. For example, each one of the sections is specifically written in the style that you would expect it to be. Like the 80s espionage is written like some crappy Ludlum novel in the 80s or something. And the letters sound very much like correspondence that you would find between Dickens or what have you. The futuristic part in the center contains very much Burgess-style creation of a new language. But that's not the book that I really want to talk about today. Sort of between Ghost Ridden and Number 9 Dream and Cloud Atlas, there was this belief among the literary establishment that yes, David Mitchell is a genius, and he is able to convincingly adapt any narrative voice that he feels and convincingly use it. And for me, that was, as a writer, that was astounding. But a lot of people did the same thing that they did to Lynch and to Anderson, and basically assumed that that was just his thing, his gimmick. So, as a result, in 2006, David Mitchell released Black Swan Green. I love this novel, and part of me feels like he wrote it because of the earlier criticisms he had on his first three novels, which I might add were all either short or long listed for the Man Booker Prize, which is essentially the British equivalent of a Pulitzer. Black Swan Green is intensely autobiographical. And if it's not, then it is wildly convincing in that that is the case. It also happens to remind me of another coming-of-age story by an English author that I also very much enjoyed, which is The Ocean at the End of the Lake, which is, again, a novella and a coming-of-age story that I believe to be intensely autobiographical. In the case of Neil Gaiman, he is far more explicit in the fantasy that he interjects into it. But Mitchell's is also very much driven by a sense of the magic of childhood and of not understanding things and the potential for all kinds of stuff. There are mysteries at the center of Black Swan Green. Then in the end, don't necessarily have any huge denouements or big reveals, but sort of the mysteries themselves are the point. The way that a child views his family and the Falkland Wars and growing up at this very particular time in England. Again, it's Mitchell's The Straight Story, but I highly recommend that you go out and pick it up just to see and check him out. He's done several great books after, including The 1,000 Autumns of Jacob de Zoet and The Bone Clocks. But I would really recommend Black Swan Green as an entry point into David Mitchell. And I understand that that would be sort of like recommending There Will Be Blood as an entry point into Paul Thomas Anderson, or recommending The Straight Story if you were going to ask about David Lynch movies. But I think it's a good starting point, especially if you're not sure if you like his style or not. I would immediately recommend it after that to go back to his first two novels. Again, Ghost Ridden and Number 9 Dream are two of my favorite novels. And I'm afraid the part of me has to agree with the New York Times reviewer about Cloud Atlas. It is amazing in itself that so many people were so moved by the sheer brilliance of it that they decided to throw hundreds of millions of dollars away on making a film that no one watched. And that in itself, I believe, is something worth checking out. But in the end, I would say that that novel is probably the one that the critics were almost right with. But anyway, so that's my recommendation for this week. I'll be uploading more videos and content throughout the week. Some video from my show last Saturday at Antique in Guanajuato, where we had some sound issues, but was entertaining nonetheless. And I'll be looking forward to interacting with you guys more and making another video for next week. So for now, that's all. Peace, love, and all of that.